why ESG is the question that Yasser Akawi, founder of Capital Concepts, will try to answer in this final presentation for the day. Yasser?
Wow, what a wonderful day. Long day, productive day, delicious lunch. And definitely a great company. So thank you, MEVP, for organizing this wonderful day that is quite inspiring, to say the least. I'm going to talk about ESG, right? Because everybody is talking about ESG. Right, regulators are talking about ESG, stakeholders are talking about ESG, human rights groups are talking about ESG, investors are talking about ESG, everybody is talking about ESG. But what is ESG is all about? So everybody is confused, right? Because we see the graphs, we see the $50 trillion that we expect to be invested in this asset class in the next few years. We see the funds, that until today, at least the European funds have close to $1 trillion invested in this asset class. But what is ESG? What does it mean to each and every one of these stakeholders? Why are governments trying to catch up with this ESG trend? Because ESG is good money, right? Because every country, has to attract the biggest amount of this asset class, of these trillions of dollars that get invested every year to be invested in their own local economies. So this is what ESG. And it becomes even more relevant for countries in emerging and frontier markets, or even markets like the GCC, in view of the COP28. So ESG is big business today, right? Of course, the regulators, are following suit. This is a very common trend, because always the private sector leads the way and the regulator follows, and the culture basically has to follow too, right? So, and this is exactly what we're going to try to attempt to understand together today, is one, to, of course, to understand the importance of ESG, and at the same time, to try to quantify or understand what is ESG is all about. Because everybody is confused about ESG, where it's coming from and where it's going. And practically, what does it mean for asset managers like MEVP? So as we see, this is a quarterly European Sustainable Fund assets in billions of euros, and their evolution through time. So as you can see, we are getting close to the $1 trillion only in sustainable fund assets. But what is really ESG, right? And where did it come from, right? Is because everybody thinks it's about the environment and society, but everybody forgets it's about the G. It's led by the G. The whole thing started in 2008, after the crisis, where we had something called the shareholder activism, or shareholder democracy started to become very prominent, with people like Bill Ackerman, Carl Icahn, who basically decided that they were not going to vote with their feet anymore and step away from companies that blink red. Instead, they're going to do research, understand why are these companies blinking red, and basically have an influence of these companies, and basically acquire them or have influence on how they're managed and make a lot of money. And these activist funds ended up, of course, outperforming other funds and other asset classes on the market. And this shareholder democracy movement that started, led to something else called the integrated reporting movement. So the integrated reporting movement is when stakeholders and shareholders and investors started requiring companies to demonstrate their commitment to everything that's very close to their heart. And the environment and society obviously are close to their heart. But how do they expect them to demonstrate this? To demonstrate it through their governance. So ESG basically is just putting the E and the S next to the G by giving a very clear signal that investors and stakeholders expect from companies to disclose more than just their financials, but also to disclose their practices and their measures and their policies regarding their impact on environment and society. So it's about governance at the end of the day. It's about either you have good governance or you have bad governance. And today, governance is inclusive of the E and the S factors. So whenever we talk about the environment, of course, we talk about the air, earth, and the water, and the wind, etc. And here we're talking about measurable figures. So we're talking about how do we measure our impact or our emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. We report about the impact on the toxicity that we have on water, about how we manage our waste and the disposal of the waste or toxic waste, etc. So it's all about disclosing this information. But to reach this disclosure, there's a whole process that comes before it. And this is where regulators and investors are falling short in what they are asking or what they are expecting from the investor. Whether it's a fund or it's an individual investor, there's a confusion. For example, if we look at the sustainable finance disclosure requirements, which basically the MEVP team has become an expert in, whether it's Hala, whether it's Romy, whether it is Marie Michel, basically everybody has become an expert in it, is basically, same thing applies to the unified guidelines that the GCC has published on the 7th of January this year. Similarly, they require companies to disclose, but they don't tell them exactly what need to be done, right? Or what should an environmental and social management system look like for the companies to be able to measure and to report, and how does this fit in a dynamic governance, policy-making system that allows companies to mitigate risk continuously on the long run. So for example, this shows you a matrix on greenhouse gas emissions around the world and how they are impacted. And there is something very important we need to add here, is some companies in the GCC and around the world, let's not isolate the GCC as if they do bad practices, but around the world, there is still people that confuse CSR with ESG. ESG and CSR are two separate words. There are $600 billion that they get, in my opinion, squandered on CSR every year. And of course, over the years, I don't see how this money had any positive impact on humanity whatsoever. And that's where ESG comes in. ESG basically is making the case that if we trigger a positive inflection point in corporate behavior itself, one that is responsible, ethical, towards environment and society, and innovative in that regard, is exactly the behavior that we expect. So what we expect is for companies to have policies that are dynamic enough to trigger a continuous improvement in how and towards the respect of the environment and society. And this is exactly what ESG is. So if we look at some facts and figures, if we look at the financial positive impact, we realize that in terms of corporates corporates or investors, we see that the impact is majorly positive, in terms of perception and in terms of why. Simply because when you have a well-governed or a company that has good ESG, it has better financial performance, it has a strategic advantage, it has enhanced reputation, it has higher profitability, it has long-term growth, and attracts and retains talent. Investors are increasingly recognizing the importance of ESG. And in that regard, if we look at institutional investors, here we have listed a few, but if we look at PIMCO, Vanguard, BlackRock, MEVP, IFC, EBRD, basically they understood the importance of ESG. And that's why they will not invest in any asset class unless it's ESG compliant. Why? Because ESG pays, and the ESG funds outperform other funds. And this is an immediate financial returns. But if we look at mitigating underlying risks and we look at long-term sustainability, this impact is huge. So what does it really mean to integrate ESG, right? So I don't know, the MEVP team are even better than me at explaining it, but there are 3 types of ESG approaches. Under SFDR, you can either comply under Chapter 6 or Chapter 8 on Chapter 9. Chapter 6 basically is the exclusionary investing, where basically a fund has to demonstrate or has to show what it excludes from investing. This is what we called before the ethical investment funds. It was called the ethical investment funds, are funds that do not invest in gambling, do not invest in alcohol, does not invest in extractive industry, among others, right? So this is the exclusionary. The positive, are companies that comply and that invest in ESG compliant funds. So what they do, they have due diligence, they have questionnaires, so they make sure in their due diligence there are certain questions that are asked to the company to demonstrate that they have an environmental social management system that is able to address these ESG risks. And basically, during the investment, their job is to monitor the commitment of these companies on improving, on mitigating these risks. And if they are registered in Luxembourg, for example, they have to report back to the regulator, demonstrating that they have their monitoring under control. And of course, there is the last one, and this is very important to say in the context of MEVP and the entrepreneurship ecosystem. It's the impact funds. Impact funds are purpose-led companies. And with my modest experience, entrepreneurship today depends on entrepreneurs that identify valid human-centered problems and they attempt to solve them. Whether it's young entrepreneurs or tech entrepreneurs, or we're talking about established companies that have been around for years, they understood that unless they peg their sustainability on valid causes, they will not be able to sustain their existence. Because if the problem is there and it's valid, no matter how many times we try to attempt to solve this problem, the problem is still valid and it's worth trying for. But if it's pegged to just one technology without a purpose, if the technology fails, the purpose of the company fades and there is no purpose of continuing. So the rise of the purpose company is at the heart of driving value and capturing value through time. Again, another graph that demonstrates the interest in sustainable investing growth, and the largest share goes to responsible investing. Again, so what drives really value creation? So what do we really expect, right? So what is the expectation? Because of course there are many MEVP team members here, and I'm sure there are a lot of team members across the VC space here, and they are also confused. I mean, because I totally understand, right? Do you really expect the deal maker to just start asking companies about their E and their S? And while they have targets to achieve in terms of taking a company from the pipeline to become investable, and unless everybody is on board to understand the value of ESG and to get everybody to own the purpose of why are we asking these questions and how these questions could also mean financial performance, then everybody can get on board. And everybody will start giving these questionnaires, no matter how diligent they are and how much heavy they are, suddenly they will make more sense. So our recommendations for companies, not recommendations, basically, what we expect from companies to do is, of course, to develop their own clear policy and strategy. Every company needs to have an ESG policy. But to have an ESG policy, they have to be able to, one, assess their ability to produce policies, and means the board of directors and who sits on these board of directors. They need to assess who is proposing the ESG strategy on a company level, and who is reviewing it, and who is approving it. And it should be very clear that it involves also the management preparedness. There should be grievance mechanisms, operational health and safety should be taken in consideration, and the measurement of the impact should be very well established, because if we are unable to measure, we are unable to report, and we are unable to report, policymakers will not be able to produce the necessary policies in that regard. And it's all about policy making. An environmental and social management system lies in the efficacy of this ESMS, which basically, like we all studied in management school, on the 9 elements of a management system. And this is exactly what MEVP has done. And this is what MEVP is betting on. So MEVP was, and I'm allowing myself in front of the MEVP team to say, is one of the first companies to develop a comprehensive ESG policy. We see a lot of ESG policies around the region and around the market. Unfortunately, many of them fall short of what the regulators around the world describe as a policy. A policy statement or a policy cannot be a promotional CSR-ish, PR-ish policy that is not pegged to serious commitment to ESG. And this is why I chapeau bas to MEVP that decided to develop its own robust, best-in-class ESG policy that not only promises the highest standards of ethical behavior, which is the exclusionary part of ESG compliance, not only to comply with ESG internally and vis-à-vis its investors, but also looks to invest in high impact and high value added companies that will have a positive impact on humanity itself. Our company, Capital Concept, basically, I might look today like a businessman. I'm not a businessman. I'm a scholar, I'm a researcher, and I'm known to develop ESG methodologies. I developed governance methodologies in the 90s and the 2000s, and since 2014, what I do, I develop ESG policies that are not only anchored in UN guiding principles and business and human rights guiding principles in cooperation with the UN and its agencies, but are also in cooperation with IFC BRT. Because, yes, maybe I have an activist in me, but at the same time, unless this activism is aligned with investor expectations, at the end of the day, we want companies to strive, to grow, to retain value, and grow value through time. Thank you so much, and I hope The world is changing, and so must we, right? And really, I commend MEVP for all its efforts in that regard, for being ahead of the curve, and to make sure that it becomes an example, that all portfolio companies would also learn from. If anybody has a question, I'm sure everybody is tired now, and
I'll ask a question.
go ahead.
Generator. Thank you, Yasser. It's always difficult to be the last panel, but I appreciate the energy. If we look at how ESG is evolving, if you can give us briefly perspective on how things are going to change in the next few years. We've seen E being emphasized, S. Recently, G came under a lot of scrutiny because of some of the things that happened. If you just give us a perspective of how ESG will develop.
The G will always be at the forefront. So the G always pulls the wagons, if you want. Because what we did, it was always been about G, right? Because many of you most probably are aware of governance assessments and methodologies since they have been around since 2006. And there is a big chunk of questions whenever we do due diligence on a company about the code of ethics. So what we did technically is we asked shareholders to pull letters or chapters from the code of ethics of companies and to highlight them. And they picked the E and the S. So technically what we did, we took management, if you want, practices that are usually in the code of ethics. We pulled them from a code of ethics and we put them next to the G. So, in a clear signal that we expect boards of directors and policymakers to take responsibility for the impact on environmental society. So this is, if you want, in general. So what we are looking forward to is more letters to be added next to the E and the S. I will give you a practical example. For today, for example, whenever we do a due diligence on a tech company, so immediately we start asking it on GDPR, and we ask it about greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by their servers or by their whatever, and this cannot last for too long. So already in the making, we know that the C will be added next to the E and the S, so cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is a big issue already, and everybody is working on what is the best due diligence that needs to be made in the protection of investors and stakeholders and shareholders in order to make sure that policymakers, which is the board of directors, are addressing the cybersecurity risk properly. So I expect the C to be added next to the E and the S. But again, the G is sacred because without the G, the E and S has no value. So what's the point of having the best policies on the E and the S if they are not verified and reviewed by a skilled board of directors frequently enough, and these policies to be always adapting to the transformations of, or the reporting that is produced by the company, and regulatory changes that are happening around the world.
Any other questions for Yasser? Yes. Okay, Yasser, thank you for a fantastic presentation. That was very informative. And it's a wrap, ladies and gentlemen, and I think it's time for me to hand over MEVP's mic back to MEVP with the closing remarks of...
Great. Thank you, Zaina. Thank you for helping us today. I know it's been a long day, so this is going to be very brief. First, it's a pleasure to have you. We broke our record of attendance this year. We have had 350 people attend today across the day, so really appreciate your patience, and I'm happy that people found our Investor Day interesting and stayed with us until after 4 p.m. Just a couple of things. 2023 is going to be the year of AI, the year of fintech, the year of corporate VCs, consolidation in M&A, more secondaries, inshallah technology listing that will help us in exits, better margins and more sustainability. We discussed camels and centaurs. The democratization of finance is offering to include, the retail investors and help them access correctly with education, financial products. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the year of VC. As Waleed Hanna said early on, VC is the new PE. This is what we've been able to build across the region. We can build regional champions with VC. We don't need debt. It's all equity. And we can really help solve pain points using technology. And just to close, 2023 is going to be the year of Middle East Venture 4, our 4th flagship fund that we just launched. And inshallah, you'll join us as investors or entrepreneurs or partners, and we can build the future together. Thank you for attending. Thanks.